Elon Musk, he's not interested in your freedom, he's interested in Elon Musk.
Pete North, Hassan Piker, Graham Linehan, Guillaume Meurice. Have you heard of these people? One thing you might know is that they've been arrested or questioned or sacked for what they say online. This is a phenomenon that is expanding. It's not just the English-speaking world. We're here to discuss the online clampdown with Kevin Myers, who's a broadcaster based in Ireland. Hi there, Kevin.
Hi, Justin, how are you?
So, what's going on, Kevin? I mean, it seems to me we've been talking about the free speech clampdown. We've even made a documentary on it. It's getting worse, isn't it?
It is. We should welcome the arrests, but it's a useful indicator of what's going on. Without the police doing this, we wouldn't be aware of the extent of censorship which people are volitionally undertaking. So when Graham Linehan, who a very fine writer and a culturally very important person, when he gets arrested, part of us should cheer. And also the other chaps you mentioned, particularly Pete North, taken from his home by idiots from the North Yorkshire police. They probably asked him how he spelt his name, North, although they are from North Yorkshire. But he was arrested for, well, I mean, you probably want to cover that yourself. But all he did was offer strong opinions about Hamas and was arrested from his home and taken to a police station and held for several hours. Now, unless you have police behaving like this, we wouldn't have any real sense of the cultural transformations that are occurring, as you say, not across just the Anglophone world, but Europe also.
So, for those who don't know, we have Hassan Piker, who was arrested at the US border after streaming with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is a French politician, very well-known left-wing politician. Thinks quite a lot of himself. Anyway, he was arrested, Mr. Piker, and questioned about his views on Trump. Mélenchon notoriously anti-Trump. Evidently, this was just a routine check, according to the border authorities. Just to prove that this is not an English-speaking phenomenon, there's another Frenchman, Guillaume Meurice, and he was basically sacked after insulting Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was a joke, and he called Netanyahu a Nazi without a foreskin or something like that. Anyway, a bad taste joke, you might say, or maybe you'd say it's a funny joke, I don't know. But this is just to prove that this is an expanding phenomenon, and I'd like to know what you think, Kevin. Is this going to get worse, do you think? Are they going to come after us?
Well, they are going to come after everybody, and that's why we should welcome the public arrests of these people who have been arrested within Britain, because we wouldn't get any real sense of the censorship that is distorting Western cultural life and Western cultural values. But one of the most disturbing characteristics of this new cultural phenomenon is the willingness of journalists to censor themselves. Now, you wouldn't know that this is going on, but it is going on, to the point, for recent now, the Daily Mail, talking about Peter North, they asterisked out in their report, he had said, referred to Hamas as being bastards. They asterisked out bastard. In court cases in Ireland in the last month, the words slut and bitch have been asterisked out. Now, this is journalists not acting under the coercion of the police or politicians, censoring themselves because they are scared of the consequences of using words which are legally protected, words that have been uttered in court. That gives them a status that words uttered by me and you wouldn't have. But nonetheless, journalists feel that somehow or other protecting the feelings of their readers is more important than telling the truth. Now, when journalists do this, how much further down the road of decay, moral and intellectual decay, is society advancing?
Right. Now, is this a new wave of puritanism? Is this what we're seeing?
Well, a lot of people have been wondering how this enormous cultural shift has occurred. It is an offshoot of the emergence of political correctness, which I suppose first made its impact on Western values about 20 years ago. And this in itself was an offshoot of Marxism. And all Marxists, without exception, believe in controlling people's lives. And the great Marxist surge in Western life occurred in the late 60s and early 1970s. So you can say that this is the great triumph of the 1960s, not sexual liberation, not feminism, but volitional embrace of the values of censorship. And this has lasted far more enduringly and more powerfully than most of us would have imagined. But it is the case that people feel obliged to curtail their language in order to protect the feelings of others, which means, of course, that would apply to everyone, but it doesn't. Within this new moral order, there are protected groups. You and I, Justin, are amongst the least protected because we're white males. I actually don't know anything about your personal life. If you were gay, you were a little bit more protected than I am. But if you are a gay, black, lesbian, you'd be even more protected than most people, and so on and forth. There is a pyramid of protection. And at the bottom of the pyramid are white heterosexual males. At the top, well, you can almost make up your mind. It'll be women, probably lesbians, probably black people, and so on and so forth, about whom you can say virtually nothing without inviting the words homophobic, misogynist, and so on and so forth, racist, etc., xenophobic. And these are words which are now routinely used by journalists to prevent other journalists speaking their mind. So we are at a cultural, in the depths of a cultural crisis. What makes the crisis so very severe is it doesn't go away. Politicians don't, at the end of any episode, say that was really stupid. We shouldn't have had that conversation, that explosion of anger. Let's just revert to what we were, where we did speak our minds. That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah,
You get minor adjustments, but the cultural shift towards censorship remains in place.
It's not only cultural as well, it's political as well, isn't it? Because, I mean, here on the other side of this desk, I've had politicians in from the what you could call the extreme left and the extreme right, but you can't even interview people without getting your reach turned down. It's not just about censorship, about getting sacked, about getting arrested, or about getting questioned. Of course, there is the intermediate stage where your reach is turned down because maybe you've interviewed a right-wing politician. Now, I think we should emphasize this. If your reach is turned down to almost zero, yeah, so you can write what the hell you like online, but nobody else will see it, that's the same as being deplatformed, essentially.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with that. I don't think I'd agree with your assessment that the censorship is equally left and right. In fact, I profoundly disagree with that because most of the censorship does come from the left. Obviously, censorship comes from the right in certain circumstances, but the right is barely represented in the media generally in both Britain and Ireland. I have done an analysis of this in both British and Irish media, and essentially it comes down to this. The term far left in the 20th century has been used 1/10 of the time that the term far right has been used. During the George Floyd riots of 5 years ago, anyone protecting values of free speech were called far right. You had something like 49 people murdered by leftist groups in America during the George Floyd riots, which were hardly ever called far left riots. So even when people were murdered, police officers murdered, and about 7 of the victims of the rioters were police officers deliberately murdered by rioters. The rioters were not called far left. They were just called, well, actually they were called largely peaceful demonstrations ended in violence. In that case, that they weren't largely peaceful. They ended up that the product was violent. Therefore, from the outset they might have been intentionally violent.
Sure. No,
When
I
you
guess
have journalists corrupting their language, then you know you're in trouble.
I guess the point I was trying to make was that even if I aim for balance, let's talk about the immigration debate. If I aim for balance by getting someone in here from the left of the European Parliament who is pro-immigration, or let's say, and then I get someone else in from the far right who is anti-immigration, the fact that I'm trying for balance doesn't actually necessarily make any difference. The only focus is on the fact that I might have given a platform to the guy from the far right. Do you see what I mean? The search for balance doesn't actually matter anymore.
You did say left and far right in the question, and that indicates how deep the cultural bias has sunk into all our vocabulary. And I'm not saying you are guilty of this, because I'm guilty of the same um, imbalance of terminology. It's so culturally normative now to use terms like far left, far right, when we don't use the equivalent term about far left, and this is now a cultural value which is so deeply embedded that you couldn't have a conversation with journalistic in a media studies course at university level and be understood by the students. The students have been so corrupted by 20 or 30 years of media studies courses that they have no perception or conception of what free speech means. It doesn't mean to them the right to utter utterly revolting opinions, such as, for example, that joke, which I thought quite amusing, about Netanyahu not being a Nazi without a foreskin. It's satire. It's satire.
Yeah, I'm
But you,
wondering.
you can make jokes about. I'm sorry, I cut across you there. But you can say remarks like that about Netanyahu within the general discourse of Western Europe, but you can't refer to Hamas in the same language without, as Peter North had discovered, he was arrested at his home for saying "fuck Hamas." Now that's simply crazy. Hamas is a terrorist, a genocidal, murderous organization.
I'm wondering if we
There
could
are no other terms to describe it.
play a couple of mental games. Or one I was thinking about last night was suppose it's 1938 and you or I, as a journalist, have the chance to interview that German chap with a moustache. Would you take it, and should it be published? And I ask this question because some people would say no, because you're giving oxygen, the oxygen of publicity, to the wrong kind of people. I mean, this is not necessarily a new argument. I remember the same thing being said by people in Spain about the ETA terrorists, for example. You shouldn't interview them. You shouldn't help their cause because they are inherently violent. But I just can't understand this argument. Surely the primary purpose of journalism is to explore the human condition. I mean, we want to inform our readers as to what's going on, and therefore if we censor ourselves, we're just not doing our job.
Well, of course, that's the point. That is the point. Of course, people should have interviewed Hitler about his proposals. Actually, he did us and the world a great favor by being very frank about what he intended to Europe for Europe's Jews on January the 30th, 1939, 6 months before, 8 months before he went to war, nearly 8 months. He said that if there is a world war, Germany will exterminate Europe's Jews. That's an undertaking that he gave. That was not merely was that broadcast over Germany, it was on the front pages of newspapers all over Europe the next day, January the 31st. So the funny thing is that even knowledge of what a man intends doesn't prevent his intentions coming to realization. So when we have volitionally embraced the concept of filleting and filtering news to suit the emotional requirements of the more vulnerable in our community, we are not protecting them. We are damaging the community as a whole. And from that kind of damage, there is little escape. We are doing damage to our Western values of immeasurable proportions. And what concerns me is that the exercises of the scissors of censorship are young journalists, the ones I was referring to earlier on, who have in Irish journalistic usage have removed the words slut and bitch and bastard from ordinary reportage, and the words are asterisked out. These are words which were commonplace 10 years ago, and they are now vanishing from journalistic discourse.
Now, let's one other mental game for you, a bit more difficult this time, Kevin. Suppose some people say the tide is turning. I've heard that said around here and in interviews. The tide is turning, and there's a surge in right-wing support. I mean, I think it's undeniable in certain countries at least. And so let's suppose down the road, 5-10 years, who knows, a lot of these parties who are now on the receiving end of the deplatforming. I'm thinking about AfD in Germany, for example. You could talk about National Rally in France, maybe. Anyway, there are a number. Suppose they take power. This is the game I'd like to play. Do you think they would do the same to their enemies?
I doubt it, but that doesn't mean that I'm correct. The point that I made earlier is the point that troubles me most of all. It's the volitional censorship at a low level, junior level, that concerns me. These people are removing an entire swathe of language from, or discourse or vocabulary from their journalistic language in order to protect certain people, such as women or lesbians or homosexuals or black people or white people.
I want to push you because you didn't really answer my question. I want to move on from culture to politics. And if it is the case, as you mentioned, that the young journalists are behind, to a greater extent, this self-censorship or censorship of others than the older generation, will it not be the case that whomever is in power, they will have the tendency, the knee-jerk reaction, to hit out at the opposition online? My point, I guess, is whoever is in power, free speech is on the decline anyway.
Yeah, I just say that. I'm sorry if I appeared to evade the question. I would never do that, Justin. But the important thing is that we do tackle these issues. Forgive me if I didn't answer coherently. There's no question that the acquisition of power leads to the belief that it also follows that you acquire power over people's language. That seems to be a norm. We don't know about what the right-wing parties such as AfD and in France will do when they come to power, because they have no precedent. They are, without any kind of example for them to follow, because they haven't emerged from an existing political culture. They are entirely new, as in Britain, Farage's party is entirely new, and we don't know what they will do. They might be as bad as the existing parties, which would be very troubling. There's no reason to believe that they are vigorous in their approach to journalism at the most basic level. Are they calling on journalists to stop censoring ordinary words from the journalistic reportage? I don't know that they are. But the issue is not left or right. Is the instinct to censor growing in cultural power in Western Europe and America and Australia and New Zealand, essentially the Anglophone world and the old Christian Caucasian world? Yes, it is, unquestionably. The one exception I would make to this, the exception which I wouldn't have expected possible, is Eastern Europe. I have a certain amount of admiration for what events are going on in Poland and Hungary, not because I necessarily agree with what's going on there, but there is clear dissent from the norms of the European Union. And I do believe the European Union is not a force for freedom. It's a cause of political coercion over national sovereignty, which is a quite complex issue and not the one we're discussing. But the coercion is an important power in our lives today in a way it wasn't 20 or 25 years ago.
In fact, that reminds me of an anecdote. I know people who work in the European Commission, some of whom come from Eastern Europe and have had experience of life under the Soviet Union, and they liken the Soviet Union to what's happening today in the European Union. And I'm trying to quote or paraphrase what a friend told me. In the European Union, you had to watch what you said in public. You couldn't speak your mind. And this is now, I'm not suggesting the European Union is the Soviet Union, but that phenomenon is perhaps similar. And you have now in Europe to watch what you say in public, and you can't speak your mind. I think that's a valid point.
Yeah, I had the good fortune, thanks to Brussels Signal, to be in Poland about a year ago, and the embrace of freedom of speech in Poland is very heartening. Very heartening. They know they've gone through no country in Europe had a worse 20th century than Poland. I mean, the most terrible things happened, but they have emerged from that catastrophe vigorously determined to protect two things: one, the freedom of their identity, and two, the freedom of speech. And they discuss things with a vigor which is really heartening, and far more vigor than I would encounter day by day in Ireland, and far more vigor than I would encounter on the BBC. The collapse of the BBC and its culture and broadcasting standards has been nothing less than disastrous. The BBC stood for freedom in every sense up until quite recently, up until the last 20, 25, 30 years. And it's gradually gone down the road of coercion and consensus. And consensus is one of our worst enemies, because consensus makes you think you're being decent because you're agreeing with everybody, but you're not being decent. You're employing a form of silent censorship, which is far more deadly than the authoritarian censorship of government, because it is when people agree not to speak the truth because they don't want to hurt people. And the BBC has been in the forefront of that.
I'm wondering, obviously, if this gets worse, one final mental game for you, how can people react if you can only get online or on the social media with their algorithms? If you follow the consensus, as you just said, how are the rebels going to react? I'm wondering if they're going to go back to the printed press. Maybe you'll get the growth of newspapers or clandestine printing presses, this kind of thing.
Yeah, you see, I don't know. I'm not on social media. I'm not on X. I'm not on Facebook. I think I regard these outlets as the invention of the devil. Obviously, that puts me back before the printing press and Gutenberg's galaxy. But I'm fairly confident the algorithms employed by Facebook and other outlets will prevent proper freedom of speech. And I don't know of a way around this, since I am technologically illiterate and have chosen to be. And I know little about the world that you perhaps inhabit, and most of our listeners or viewers will inhabit. They and you on a different platform. For me, I am back really in the pre intelligence world of
Well,
back of the old-fashioned printing press. But I would worry greatly if you use social media. You are in thrall to Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley will sooner or later control you. Elon Musk, for the moment, appears to be a force of liberation. He's a multi-billionaire. He's not interested in your freedom. He's interested in Elon Musk. Sooner or later, people like him will close down freedom of speech. I don't trust anyone who is as powerful as he is, and I wouldn't trust me if I was as powerful as he is.
fair point, fair point. And whereas you might call yourself a Luddite, we've managed to get you online today, Kevin. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you, Justin. It's great talking to you, as always.
And join us next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.